Hey guys, welcome to my new mystery.
The morning of Tuesday, October 22nd, began like most others in the old brownstone on West 35th Street, which is to say it began with the comforting certainty that Nero Wolfe would not descend from his plant rooms until 11 o'clock sharp, and that I would have the office to myself until then to catch up on correspondence, balance the books, and contemplate the eternal mystery of how a man who weighs 1/7 of a ton can move so quietly that you never hear him coming until he's already there. I was typing up the final report on the Hendricks insurance case, a tedious affair involving a man who claimed his prize orchids had been poisoned by a rival grower, until Wolfe pointed out that the alleged victim had been overwatering them with tap water that contained enough chlorine to sterilize a swimming pool, when Fritz appeared in the doorway with his silver tray and an expression that suggested the morning mail contained something more interesting than bills and seed catalog. "There is a gentleman to see Mr. Wolfe," he announced. "He says it is a matter concerning Mr. Goodwin specifically." I stopped typing and looked up. In 12 years of working for Nero Wolfe, I had grown accustomed to clients who wanted to discuss missing persons, stolen jewelry, blackmail, murder, and once memorably, a parrot that could predict horse races. But I had never encountered anyone who wanted to discuss me. His name? Mr. Theodore Bassett. He carries a briefcase and the manner of a man who has practiced delivering bad news. That was Fritz's way of saying the visitor looked like a lawyer, which in my experience meant trouble with a college education and a pressed suit. I glanced at the clock. 10:45. Wolfe would be down in 15 minutes, and his mood upon discovering that someone had disrupted the morning routine by arriving early would be approximately that of a grizzly bear awakened from hibernation by a brass band. "Show him in," I said. "And Fritz, bring coffee. Strong coffee." The man who entered was indeed a lawyer, or at least he played one convincingly. He was about 55, with silver hair that had been professionally styled and a navy suit that had probably cost more than I made in a month. His briefcase was leather, expensive, and worn enough to suggest he actually used it for work rather than decoration. He had the kind of handshake that meant business and the kind of smile that meant trouble. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm Theodore Bassett of Bassett, Morrison and Associates. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Don't thank me yet," I said, gesturing to the red leather chair. "Mr. Wolfe will be down shortly. You'll have some coffee?" "Please." He settled into the chair and placed his briefcase on the floor beside him with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly what was inside and wasn't looking forward to revealing it. "I should mention that this matter is somewhat delicate. It concerns a client of yours, or rather, a former client." I poured coffee from the pot Fritz had brought and handed Bassett a cup. "Which former client?" "Mrs. Victoria Ashford." The name hit me like a cold slap. Victoria Ashford had hired us 6 weeks ago to investigate her suspicions that her business partner was embezzling from their import company. Wolfe had solved the case in a week, proving that the partner, a nervous little man named Corrigan, had been skimming profits to pay gambling debts. Mrs. Ashford had paid our fee promptly and expressed her gratitude in a handwritten note that had made even Wolfe's eyebrows rise slightly in what might have been approval. "What about Mrs. Ashford?" I asked. Bassett reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. 3 days ago, Mrs. Ashford discovered that $25,000 was missing from her personal account. The bank's records show that the money was withdrawn by check, made out to cash, and signed with her name. He opened the folder and removed a photostatic copy of a check. However, Mrs. Ashford insists she did not write this check. I looked at the copy. The signature looked authentic to my untrained eye, but handwriting analysis wasn't my specialty. And this concerns us how? The check was cashed at First National Bank on Monday afternoon at approximately 2:30. The teller who processed the transaction has identified the person who presented it. Bassett's smile grew thinner. According to the teller, It was you, Mr. Goodwin. The coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. I set it down carefully on the saucer, buying time while my brain processed what I'd just heard. Someone had forged Victoria Ashford's signature on a check for $25,000 and then somehow convinced a bank teller that I had cashed it. "That's impossible," I said. "I haven't been to First National Bank in months, and I certainly haven't cashed any checks for Mrs. Ashford." The teller was quite certain of the identification. She remembered you specifically because you were, and I quote, "very polite and well-dressed, with an easy smile and dark hair." Bassett consulted a typewritten sheet from his folder. She also noted that you presented proper identification, a driver's license in the name of Archie Goodwin. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came with trouble arriving uninvited. "Mr. Bassett, I can assure you that I did not cash that check. Someone is either lying or mistaken." "Perhaps. But Mrs. Ashford is convinced that you and Mr. Wolfe conspired to defraud her. She has asked me to demand the return of the $25,000 plus damages, or she will be forced to involve the police." The sound of the elevator descending interrupted what I had been about to say, which was probably for the best, since it involved several words that Fritz would have disapproved of. Wolfe entered the office at precisely 11 o'clock, as he had every morning for the past decade, and took his place behind the desk with the measured dignity of a judge ascending to the bench. He glanced at Bassett, then at me, then at the folder on the desk. His expression didn't change, but I caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant he was already calculating angles and probabilities. "Mr. Bassett," he said, somehow managing to convey both welcome and dismissal in the pronunciation of the name. "You have business with us?" Bassett repeated his story, laying out the evidence with the methodical precision of an experienced attorney. The forged check, the bank teller's identification, Mrs. Ashford's demand for restitution. Wolfe listened without interruption, his massive frame motionless in the custom-built chair, his attention focused with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. When Bassett finished, Wolfe was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Bassett, has Mrs. Ashford reported this alleged theft to the police?" "Not yet. She hoped to resolve the matter privately." "How considerate of her." Wolfe's tone suggested he found Mrs. Ashford's consideration about as genuine as a $3 bill. "And you have brought this accusation to my attention because Mrs. Ashford believes you and Mr. Goodwin conspired to defraud her, and she wants the money returned before involving the authorities." Wolfe leaned back in his chair and regarded Bassett with the expression he usually reserved for people who interrupted his dinner. "Mr. Bassett, in 30 years of practice, I have never stolen so much as a postage stamp. Mr. Goodwin has been in my employ for 12 years, and his integrity is beyond question. Your client's accusations are not merely false. They are preposterous. Nevertheless, the evidence, Wolfe interrupted, suggests that someone has gone to considerable trouble to implicate Mr. Goodwin in a crime he did not commit. The question is why." He turned to me. "Archie, can you account for your whereabouts Monday afternoon?" I thought back. Monday had been routine. Correspondence in the morning, a trip to the bank to make a deposit for petty cash, lunch at Rusterman's, then back to the office for the afternoon. I was here most of the day. I went out for lunch around noon and stopped at Manufacturers Trust to make a deposit. I have the receipt. "Which bank?" "Manufacturers Trust on 8th Avenue. I was back here by 2 o'clock. Wolfe nodded slowly. "Mr. Bassett, your client's check was allegedly cashed at First National at 2:30 Monday afternoon. Mr. Goodwin was here, in this office, at that time. I can vouch for that personally." Bassett consulted his notes. The teller was quite certain of the identification. Then the teller was mistaken, or someone presented false identification, or your client is lying. Wolfe's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. In any case, Mr. Goodwin did not cash that check. Bassett closed his folder and stood up. Mrs. Ashford will not be satisfied with denials, Mr. Wolfe. She wants her money back. Then she should look for the person who actually took it, Wolfe replied. Good day, Mr. Bassett. After the lawyer left, Wolfe and I sat in silence for several minutes. I could hear Fritz in the kitchen, probably preparing lunch, and the familiar sounds of the house settling around us. Finally, Wolfe spoke. Archie, someone has gone to considerable trouble to make you appear guilty of embezzlement. The question is whether this is the beginning or the end of their plan. I had been thinking the same thing. You think there's more coming? I think, Wolfe said, pressing the button that would summon Fritz with beer, that we are about to become very busy indeed. He was right, of course. He usually was. But even Nero Wolfe, with all his intellectual prowess and deductive brilliance, could not have predicted just how busy we were about to become, or how personal this case would get before it was over. The game, as they say, was afoot, and for the first time in 12 years, I was playing it from the wrong side of the board. The first sign that our morning's troubles were merely the opening notes of a more complex symphony came at 2:15, when the doorbell rang with the insistent rhythm of people who had decided that politeness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Fritz appeared in the doorway, wearing the expression he reserved for occasions when civilization had taken a temporary leave of absence. There are 4 persons to see Mr. Wolfe, he announced with the careful precision of a man reporting a small invasion. Mrs. Ashford has returned, accompanied by her attorney and 2 others who appear to represent the banking industry. I glanced at the clock. Wolfe would not be down from his plant rooms for another 45 minutes, and his reaction to having his afternoon routine disrupted by what amounted to a delegation would be approximately that of a hibernating bear disturbed by a marching band. But there was something in Fritz's manner that suggested this wasn't a social call that could be postponed. Show them in, I said. And Fritz, bring the good coffee service. Something tells me we're going to need the armor of proper hospitality. The procession that entered the office looked like a small legal convention with banking credentials. Mrs. Victoria Ashford led the parade, dressed in a navy suit that had been tailored by someone who understood that authority could be sewn into shoulder seams. Behind her came Bassett, looking grimmer than he had that morning, followed by a young woman with intelligent eyes and the careful posture of someone who spent her days handling other people's money. The 4th member of the group was a thick-set man with a watchful expression of institutional security. Mr. Goodwin, Mrs. Ashford said without preamble, I've brought Miss Paula Dwyer from First National Bank. She's the teller who processed the transaction Monday afternoon. She gestured to the young woman, who stepped forward with the nervous determination of a witness about to testify. Miss Dwyer, please look at Mr. Goodwin carefully and tell us if he's the man you saw. Miss Dwyer studied me with the methodical attention of a professional who had been trained to notice details. Her examination was thorough and uncomfortable, taking in everything from my hairline to my collar. After what felt like a full minute, she nodded. That's him, she said with quiet certainty. That's the man who cashed Mrs. Ashford's check Monday afternoon. You're sure? I asked. Positive. You were wearing a gray fedora with a green feather, a camel hair topcoat and brown leather gloves. You presented a driver's license with your name on it, and when I handed you the money, you said, "Much obliged." You also have that small scar above your left eyebrow. The accuracy of her description was unsettling, particularly since I do own a gray fedora, though mine has never been decorated with feathers of any color, and I do habitually say, "Much obliged" to people who provide services. The scar she mentioned was a souvenir from a disagreement in Queens several years ago, not visible from across a room, but certainly noticeable at close range. Miss Dwyer, I said carefully, I appreciate your attention to detail, but I wasn't at First National Bank Monday afternoon. I was here, in this office. The thick-set man stepped forward. Leland Purvis, bank security. Miss Dwyer is one of our most experienced tellers. She doesn't make mistakes about identifications. Before I could respond, the familiar creak of the elevator announced Wolfe's descent. He entered the office with his usual measured dignity, took in the assembled crowd with a single comprehensive glance, and settled into his chair with the air of a judge taking the bench for a particularly tedious case. "Mrs. Ashford," he said without preliminary courtesies, "you have elected to transform my office into a courtroom. I trust you have evidence to justify the presumption." Bassett opened his briefcase and withdrew the familiar manila folder. "Mr. Wolfe, in addition to Miss Dwyer's positive identification, we now have this." He produced a clear plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a driver's license. This forged license, bearing Mr. Goodwin's name and photograph, was discovered in a trash receptacle 2 blocks from the bank. Wolfe examined the license through the plastic without touching it. "Interesting. What conclusions do you draw from this discovery?" "That your assistant used false identification to commit fraud," Purvis said bluntly. "An alternative conclusion," Wolfe replied with dangerous calm, "is that someone has gone to considerable trouble to implicate Mr. Goodwin in a crime he did not commit." He turned to Miss Dwyer. "You mentioned that the gentleman said, 'much obliged.' Did he say anything else?" Miss Dwyer frowned, concentrating. "When I was checking the signature," he said. "Take your time. We're not in a race." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "We're not in a race" was one of Wolfe's favorite expressions, something he said regularly when he wanted people to be thorough rather than hasty. It wasn't a phrase I used, but anyone who had spent time in this office would have heard it repeatedly. Wolfe's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Indeed, how remarkably specific. He pressed the button that would summon Fritz with Bear. "Miss Dwyer, you have been most helpful. Your powers of observation are commendable." The telephone rang, interrupting what I sensed was about to become a more intensive interrogation. I answered it, grateful for the distraction. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Sarah Chen, Assistant Manager at Manufacturers Trust. I'm calling about an attempted transaction on your personal account this morning." My blood pressure spiked. "What kind of transaction?" "Someone tried to withdraw $25,000 using what appeared to be your identification. Our teller became suspicious when the individual couldn't answer basic security questions about your account history. We have the person on our security cameras." I thanked Ms. Chen and hung up, aware that everyone in the room was watching me. "Someone just tried to withdraw $25,000 from my personal account using forged identification," I announced. "The bank caught it because the impersonator couldn't answer security questions." Mrs. Ashford's face went pale. $25,000. The same amount as my check. "Precisely," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose theory had just been confirmed. "Someone is conducting a systematic campaign to implicate Mr. Goodwin in financial crimes. The question is why?" Bassett looked troubled. "This does put a different complexion on matters." "It puts the correct complexion on matters," Wolfe corrected. "Someone has studied Mr. Goodwin carefully enough to mimic his appearance, his mannerisms, and even his vocabulary. More significantly, they have appropriated phrases that are distinctly mine, suggesting familiarity with conversations that take place in this office." He turned his attention to Mrs. Ashford. "Madame, you have been the victim of a crime, but not by Mr. Goodwin. Someone has used your misfortune as a weapon against my establishment. That makes this a matter of personal interest to me." Mrs. Ashford looked uncertain for the first time since entering the office. "Are you saying someone is using me to attack you?" "I'm saying," Wolfe replied with the finality of a closing argument, "that we have been drawn into someone else's game. The question now is whether we play by their rules or impose our own." The office fell silent except for the familiar sounds of the house around us. Finally, Mrs. Ashford spoke. "What do you propose to do?" Wolfe smiled, and it was not a comfortable expression. I propose to find out who has the audacity to trespass in my domain, and then I propose to make them regret it, thoroughly. As the delegation prepared to leave, I noticed Purvis casting appraising glances around the office, as if memorizing details for future reference. It was a small thing, but in a case built on small things, it registered as another piece of the puzzle. After they left, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "Archie, someone has been watching us, studying us, learning our habits, our speech patterns, our routines. This is not the work of a casual enemy. Any ideas who? Not yet. But whoever it is, they have made a fundamental error in judgment." He reached for his beer. "They have mistaken my fondness for routine as a weakness. They are about to discover that when my routine is threatened, I become considerably less predictable." I'd seen that look before, and it never boded well for whoever had earned Wolfe's focused attention. The game was indeed afoot, and Nero Wolfe had just declared his intention to win it. The second wave of unwelcome visitors arrived at 4:30, just as Wolfe was settling into his afternoon routine with a copy of the American Orchid Society Bulletin, and what I suspected would be his fourth beer of the day. Fritz's announcement carried the weary tone of a man who had given up hope that Tuesday would return to normal. "Inspector Kramer is here," he said, accompanied by Sergeant Stebbins and a gentleman from the district attorney's office. Wolfe's sigh was audible across the room. In 12 years of working together, I had learned to interpret the subtle variations in his expressions of displeasure, and this particular sigh meant that our day was about to become significantly more complicated. Inspector Kramer's visits were never social calls, and when he brought backup from downtown, it usually meant someone was about to be arrested. "Show them in," Wolfe said, closing his magazine with the careful precision of a man preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. "And Fritz, coffee, but not the good service. This will be business, not hospitality." Kramer entered first, his stocky frame radiating the controlled tension of a man who had been dealing with crime for 30 years and still took it personally when the law was bent out of shape. Behind him came Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, whose expression suggested he would prefer arresting someone to sitting through another conversation, followed by a thin young man in an expensive suit who had the eager look of an assistant district attorney scenting his first major case. "Wolfe," Kramer said without ceremony, settling his bulk into the red leather chair with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "We need to talk about your boy here." He jerked his thumb in my direction. "Someone's been spreading stories about him, and they're the kind of stories that make my job complicated." The young prosecutor stepped forward with the nervous energy of ambition barely held in check. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm Assistant District Attorney Robert Henley. We've received a formal complaint alleging that Mr. Goodwin has been involved in bank fraud, specifically the theft of $25,000 from Mrs. Victoria Ashford." "You've received a complaint," Wolfe repeated with the tone he reserved for statements that were technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. "From whom, and based on what evidence?" "Mrs. Ashford came to our office this afternoon with her attorney and representatives from First National Bank," Henley replied, consulting a leather portfolio. "The evidence appears substantial. Positive identification by a bank teller, forged identification documents recovered near the scene, and what appears to be a pattern of suspicious financial activity." Kramer leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face creased with the kind of skepticism that came from decades of sorting truth from fiction. "Wolfe, I've known Goodwin for 12 years. He's a wise guy and a pain in the neck, but he's not a thief. Someone's running a game here, and I want to know who and why." "Your confidence in Mr. Goodwin's character is noted," Wolfe said dryly. "What specifically brings you to my office rather than simply issuing a warrant?" "Because whoever's running this game knows too much about your operation," Kramer replied bluntly. "They know Goodwin's habits, his appearance, even the way he talks. That suggests someone with inside information, and that makes this more than just a simple fraud case." The telephone rang, interrupting what promised to become a more intensive discussion. I answered it, recognizing the voice of Saul Panzer, the best freelance operative in New York and one of the few people Wolfe trusted without reservation. "Archie, I've been asking around about your little problem," Saul said without preamble. "Word on the street is that someone's been shopping a story about you and Wolfe being involved in something shady. The details are vague, but the source seems to have money to spread around. Any idea who's behind it?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it. There's something else, though. 3 different people have mentioned seeing someone who looked like you in places where you weren't. Always doing things that would make you look suspicious if anyone bothered to check. And Archie, someone tried to access your personal account at Manufacturers Trust this morning. The bank caught it, but whoever it was had good identification." I thanked Saul and hung up, aware that everyone in the room was listening to my half of the conversation. "Someone's been spreading rumors about us around town," I reported. "And apparently, my impersonator has been busy establishing a pattern of suspicious behavior. They also tried to access my personal bank account this morning." Henley looked intrigued. "What kind of pattern?" "The kind that would make a prosecutor think he had a solid case," Kramer answered before I could respond. "Someone's building a frame and they're being methodical about it." Wolfe had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention he usually reserved for particularly challenging problems in orchid cultivation. Now he leaned back in his chair and regarded our visitors with the expression of a man who had just identified the species of a rare and dangerous plant. "Gentlemen, someone has invested considerable time and resources in an elaborate scheme to discredit Mr. Goodwin and, by extension, my establishment. This is not a simple matter of theft. This is a deliberate, orchestrated assault." He pressed the button that would summon Fritz with beer. "Mr. Henley, you mentioned a pattern of suspicious activity. What specifically has been reported?" Henley consulted his portfolio. "Over the past 3 weeks, someone matching Mr. Goodwin's description has been seen at several banks, asking detailed questions about account security procedures. He's also been observed at the offices of 3 different import companies, apparently conducting what he described as background investigations." "Import companies," I repeated. "Like Mrs. Ashford's business." "Exactly like Mrs. Ashford's business," Kramer confirmed. "Someone's been doing homework, learning about her operation, her banking habits, her security procedures. Then they used that information to set up the perfect frame." Wolfe nodded slowly. "A frame that would be most effective if Mr. Goodwin were arrested and charged, thereby preventing him from conducting the investigation that might expose the real criminal." He turned his attention to me. "Archie, this suggests 3 possibilities. First, Arthur Corrigan, whom we recently exposed as an embezzler. He possesses both motive and intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's financial arrangements." "Corrigan's got the grudge," I agreed. "He lost his job, his reputation, probably his savings. He was in this office often enough during our investigation to pick up on your speech patterns." "Second," Wolfe continued, "Marcus Thorne, Mrs. Ashford's senior partner. While ostensibly a victim of Corrigan's embezzlement, he was remarkably detached throughout our investigation. Was he truly unaware of his partner's activities or merely adept at concealment?" Kramer looked interested. "You think the senior partner might be involved?" "I think," Wolfe replied carefully, "that in matters of financial fraud, one should always examine those with the greatest access to the mechanisms of deception. Mr. Thorne had complete access to the company's records and banking relationships." "And third?" Henley prompted. "Eleanor Vance, Mrs. Ashford's personal assistant. She was present during most of our meetings, handled the paperwork, and observed our methods closely. More significantly, she would have had access to Mrs. Ashford's personal banking information and daily routines." Fritz appeared, with beer, moving with a silent efficiency that had made him indispensable to Wolfe's routine for the past 15 years. As Wolfe opened his bottle, I noticed him glancing toward the window that faced the street, a habit he had developed recently that suggested he was more concerned about our security than he cared to admit. Kramer stood up, signaling that the official portion of the visit was ending. "Wolfe, I'm giving you 48 hours to figure out who's behind this before the pressure from downtown forces my hand. After that, I may not be able to keep Goodwin out of handcuffs." 48 hours, Wolfe repeated. "How generous of you, Inspector." "It's more generous than you deserve, considering how many times you've made my life difficult over the years," Kramer replied, but there was no real heat in his voice. "Don't make me regret it." After they left, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, occasionally sipping his beer and staring at the ceiling with the concentrated attention he usually reserved for particularly challenging crossword puzzles. Finally, he spoke. "Archie, someone has declared war on us. They have chosen their weapons carefully: reputation, credibility, and the machinery of law enforcement. It's an elegant strategy, assuming we respond predictably." He pressed the button for Fritz again. "However, they have made a fundamental error in judgment. They have mistaken my fondness for routine as weakness. And how do we prove them wrong? We accept their challenge, but we play by different rules. They expect us to defend. Instead, we attack." Wolfe reached for the phone. "Fritz, summon Saul Panzer immediately. Inform him that I require his services for a matter of considerable urgency and delicacy." When Saul Panzer was called in, it meant the gloves were coming off. The methodical build-up was about to transition into a more aggressive phase of strategic maneuvering, and I had a feeling that Arthur Corrigan, Marcus Thorne, and Eleanor Vance were about to find themselves under a very bright, very uncomfortable spotlight. The war, it seemed, was about to begin in earnest, and Nero Wolfe had just declared his intention to win it decisively. Saul Panzer materialized in the office at 6:15 with the silent efficiency that had made him Wolfe's most trusted operative for the better part of 2 decades. He settled into the yellow chair with the casual precision of a man who had just completed several hours of methodical intelligence gathering, and his expression suggested that the information he carried would prove both illuminating and disturbing. "Your impersonator has been busy," he began without preamble, consulting a small notebook that somehow contained more information than most filing cabinets. "I've traced his movements over the past 3 weeks. And the picture that emerges is both sophisticated and deeply personal." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his attention focused with the intensity he reserved for reports from people whose judgment he trusted completely. "Proceed." The forged driver's license was professionally made, probably costing upward of $500. The green feather for the fedora was purchased Saturday at Benedict's Haberdashery on Madison Avenue by a man who paid cash and gave his name as Gordon. The clerk remembered him because he spoke with what she described as a practiced voice, like someone who'd been listening to other people talk. I felt a chill at that description. Someone had been studying not just my appearance, but my speech patterns, my mannerisms, even the subtle details that would make their impersonation convincing to a trained observer like a bank teller. "The Bay Rum Cologne is significant," Saul continued. "It's an old-fashioned scent, not commonly used today. I've traced purchases to 3 shops in Manhattan over the past month. All cash transactions, all by men who avoided direct eye contact with the clerks." "And the Band-Aid on the middle knuckle?" I asked. "Appeared in security footage from both banks. Either it's genuine camouflage for an injury, or it's a deliberate detail designed to make the impersonation more memorable and believable." Saul turned a page in his notebook. "There's more. Someone matching your description has been seen at 4 different import companies over the past 3 weeks, asking detailed questions about their banking procedures and security arrangements." Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. "Building a comprehensive understanding of the industry's financial practices. Most thorough." "It gets more interesting," Saul said. I've also discovered that someone has been spreading rumors about you and Wolfe being involved in questionable financial dealings. The stories are being circulated through Danny Morse, a small-time publicity agent who works out of the garment district. He claims to be representing a client who has evidence of corruption in the private investigation business. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about framing me for a single theft. It was a coordinated campaign designed to destroy both my reputation and Wolfe's business. Someone had invested considerable time, money, and effort in a scheme that was as personal as it was professional. "Saul, I want you to have a conversation with Mr. Morse," Wolfe instructed. "But carefully. We want information, not confrontation. Also, arrange surveillance on our 3 primary suspects. I want to know their movements, their associations, and their communications." After Saul left to begin his expanded investigation, I prepared for my own fieldwork. The afternoon interviews would require careful attention to both what was said and what was deliberately omitted, and I suspected that each of our suspects would reveal more through their evasions than through their direct statements. Arthur Corrigan's desperation. I found Corrigan in a rooming house on the Lower East Side that looked like it was one missed rent payment away from condemnation. The man who answered my knock bore little resemblance to the confident embezzler we had exposed 6 weeks earlier. He had lost weight he couldn't spare, gained stubble he hadn't intended, and his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had discovered that falling from grace was a steeper descent than he had imagined. "Goodwin," he said, making my name sound like both an accusation and a prayer. "Come to gloat?" "I never gloat on an empty stomach, and rarely on a Tuesday," I replied, stepping past him into a room that smelled of defeat and cheap whiskey. "Someone's been playing an interesting game with your former employer's money, and they've been kind enough to use my face while doing it." He laughed, one bitter bark. "Someone's framing you. That's rich. How does it feel to be on the wrong end of an investigation?" "Enlightening. Where were you Monday afternoon at 2:30? "Right here, drowning my sorrows and entertaining my creditors. The landlord's nephew came to collect rent. $12, and I asked for a receipt. He offered to tattoo it on my forehead instead. His alibi was crude, but probably verifiable. More interesting was his reaction to my questions about the impersonation. He showed genuine curiosity rather than the defensive evasion I would have expected from someone trying to cover their tracks. "Corrigan, someone's been asking detailed questions about my appearance, my habits, my daily routine. They know things that only someone familiar with our office would know, including phrases that Wolfe uses regularly. Like, 'We're not in a race,' he said with a bitter smile. Your boss must have said that 50 times during his investigation of my so-called crimes." "Who else heard those conversations?" "Everyone. Thorne, Eleanor, even Mrs. Ashford when she bothered to attend the meetings." His expression darkened. "But if you want to know who really had access to information, you should be talking to Marcus Thorne. He's the one who set me up in the first place." "How so?" "He knew about my gambling debts. Hell, he encouraged them. Said the company could cover my losses if I just kept the books looking clean. Then when things got too big to hide, he threw me under the bus so fast my head spun." Corrigan's voice carried the conviction of genuine resentment. "He's the real snake in that operation, Goodwin. I was just the convenient scapegoat." Eleanor Vance's precision. I found Eleanor Vance still at the office at 7 o'clock, working with the methodical efficiency that had made her indispensable to Mrs. Ashford's operation. She was precisely dressed, precisely spoken, and precisely evasive in ways that suggested considerable practice at managing uncomfortable conversations. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, looking up from a stack of correspondence with the kind of smile that was professionally warm and personally distant. "I understand you're investigating the situation with Mrs. Ashford's forged check. Among other things, you handle Mrs. Ashford's personal banking arrangements. I assist with bill payments and record keeping. Her personal accounts are managed by her financial advisor. though I do coordinate with the bank on routine matters, such as scheduling appointments, confirming wire transfers, that sort of thing. Mrs. Ashford prefers to handle significant transactions personally, but she relies on me to manage the administrative details. I noticed a small framed photograph on her desk, partially hidden behind a stack of papers. It showed Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford at what appeared to be a company function, both smiling, but Mrs. Ashford's arm was around Eleanor's shoulder in a gesture that seemed more personal than professional. "You and Mrs. Ashford appear to have a close working relationship," I observed. A flicker of something, pride, possessiveness, or perhaps anxiety, crossed her features. Mrs. Ashford is a demanding but fair employer. I've been with her for 8 years. And Marcus Thorne, how would you describe your working relationship with him? The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and her voice became more carefully controlled. Mr. Thorne is a competent businessman. He handles the import operations while Mrs. Ashford manages distribution and client relations. Were you aware of Arthur Corrigan's gambling problems before our investigation exposed his embezzlement? I was aware that Mr. Corrigan had financial difficulties. It was a concern for the company. Did you ever observe any interactions between Corrigan and Thorne that suggested Thorne might have been aware of or even encouraging Corrigan's gambling? Her composure cracked for just a moment. Mr. Thorne's relationship with Mr. Corrigan was purely professional. Mr. Corrigan's personal problems were his own responsibility. The denial was too quick, too absolute. Eleanor Vance knew more about the dynamics between Thorne and Corrigan than she was willing to admit, and her protective attitude toward Mrs. Ashford suggested that her loyalties might be more complex than simple professional duty. Marcus Thorne's performance. Marcus Thorne received me in his corner office with the confident ease of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing cooperative while revealing nothing of substance. He was impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of authority that came from success, and his handshake was calculated to convey both power and trustworthiness. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, settling back into his leather chair with practiced grace. "This business with Victoria's forged check is quite disturbing. I understand you're conducting your own investigation. Someone's been impersonating me with considerable skill and inside knowledge. They know details about Mrs. Ashford's banking habits, my personal routines, even phrases that my employer uses regularly. That suggests someone with access to privileged information." Thorne nodded thoughtfully. "It does sound remarkably sophisticated, almost as if someone has been conducting surveillance on both you and our operation." He paused, as if considering possibilities. "Have you considered that this might be the work of a competitor? Someone seeking to damage both our business and yours? Possible, but unlikely. The level of personal detail suggests someone with direct access to both operations." I watched his reaction carefully. "Arthur Corrigan claims you encouraged his gambling, then set him up to take the fall for embezzlement you knew was occurring." Thorne's laugh was smooth, dismissive, and entirely unconvincing. "Arthur is a desperate man, Mr. Goodwin. Desperate men say desperate things. I had no knowledge of his gambling problem until it became impossible to ignore, and the suggestion that I would deliberately sabotage my own company is absurd. Unless sabotaging one partnership was the price of creating a more advantageous arrangement," I suggested. His eyes sharpened slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but my relationship with Victoria has always been excellent. We built this company together." "And Eleanor Vance? She seems remarkably devoted to Mrs. Ashford." "Eleanor is an exceptional assistant, utterly loyal, completely discreet, and absolutely devoted to Victoria's interests." The way he emphasized devoted carried implications that could have been admiration, observation, or something more calculating. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with a book on rare fungi, but his attention shifted to me the moment I entered the office. I reported my findings in detail, noting the evasions, the contradictions, and the subtle tensions that had emerged during each interview. "So," Wolfe said when I finished, "Corrigan points to Thorne. Vance shows discomfort when Thorne is mentioned, and Thorne hints at Vance's exceptional devotion to Mrs. Ashford. Each has motive, each has opportunity, and each has demonstrated knowledge of our methods and vocabulary." "Any theories about which one is running the show?" "Several theories, but insufficient evidence to support any of them definitively." He pressed the button that would summon Fritz with beer. "However, one element is becoming clear. This conspiracy involves more than simple revenge or financial gain. Someone is orchestrating a systematic campaign designed not merely to frame you, but to destroy the credibility that is the foundation of our professional existence." The telephone rang, interrupting his analysis. I answered it, recognizing Saul's voice. "Archie, I've had an interesting conversation with Danny Morse. He's been paid $5,000 to spread rumors about you and Wolfe, with a promise of another $5,000 when the story breaks in a major newspaper. The money came through an intermediary, but Morse let slip that his client has inside information about how private investigators really operate." "Any idea who the intermediary is?" "Working on it. But there's something else. I've been watching Eleanor Vance's apartment, and she had a visitor tonight, Marcus Thorne. They talked for over an hour, and when he left, she made several phone calls. One was to Mrs. Ashford, one was to a number I'm still tracing, and one was to this brownstone." I thanked Saul and hung up, aware that Wolfe had been listening to my half of the conversation with the focused attention he reserved for significant developments. "Miss Vance called here?" he asked. "Apparently, but we didn't receive any call." "No," Wolfe said slowly. "We did not." Which suggests that Miss Vance wanted to determine whether we were at home, rather than to speak with us. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Archie, I believe our adversaries are preparing for their final gambit. Tomorrow will bring either their triumph or their downfall." "Any preferences about which?" "Oh, yes," Wolfe replied, and his smile was not pleasant. "I have very definite preferences, and tomorrow evening we shall discover whether our opponents share my appreciation for intellectual precision." The pieces were moving into position for what promised to be a decisive confrontation, and for the first time since this elaborate game began, I felt confident that Nero Wolfe was about to demonstrate why it was unwise to challenge him on his own territory. Wednesday morning brought the kind of deceptive calm that often precedes a storm, with autumn sunlight filtering through the office windows and the familiar sounds of Fritz preparing breakfast in the kitchen. I was at my desk by 8:30, reviewing my notes from the previous day's interviews and trying to identify the patterns that would reveal which of our three suspects was orchestrating the campaign against us, when Fritz appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested civilization had suffered a minor but significant breach. "Mr. Goodwin," he said with the careful precision of a man reporting a disaster, "someone has been in my kitchen." In 12 years of working in the brownstone, I'd learned to interpret the subtle variations in Fritz's announcements, and this particular tone meant that someone had committed an act of domestic sacrilege that went beyond mere trespass into the realm of personal violation. I followed him to the kitchen, where he stood beside his meticulously organized spice rack like a general surveying a battlefield. In his hand, he held a small glass jar labeled in his precise script, "Paprika, Zagady, Hungary." "This morning, when I prepared Mr. Wolfe's eggs, I noticed something wrong," he began, his voice tight with controlled indignation. "The seal on this jar had been disturbed. Not obviously, whoever did this was careful, but the inner paper seal had been lifted and replaced." He opened the jar and held it toward me. "The aroma is wrong. Someone has removed perhaps 2 grams of the genuine Hungarian paprika and replaced it with common supermarket powder. To most people, the difference would be undetectable. But to Mr. Wolfe, ... The implications hit me like a cold slap. Someone had not merely entered our fortress. They had done so with the specific intent of sending a message to Wolfe through the one medium guaranteed to reach him, his palate. It was an act of psychological warfare disguised as culinary sabotage. Did you hear anything last night? Notice anything else disturbed? Fritz shook his head, but his expression grew more troubled. Nothing obvious. But there was a scent in the hallway this morning, faint but distinctive. Bay rum cologne, the old-fashioned kind. And when I checked the back door, the chain was properly secured, but the hook showed a bright scratch where it had been lifted and replaced with slightly less precision than I use. The picture was becoming clear. Our impersonator had graduated from external mimicry to internal violation, demonstrating not only the ability to breach our security, but also the intimate knowledge required to target Wolfe's most sensitive vulnerabilities. I made a systematic circuit of the office, looking for signs of disturbance that might escape casual observation. The desk blotter on Wolfe's desk had been rotated slightly. The worn spot where his right forearm rested had moved from the edge to the corner. A small ink stain shaped like New Jersey was pointing north instead of east. My address file showed similar signs of careful examination, with the A tab pushed slightly back and the cards spaced with mathematical precision that wasn't quite my own. But it was the telephone that provided the most unsettling discovery. Using my thumbnail to unscrew the mouthpiece cap, I found a small black disc nestled in the cavity behind the transmitter, a listening device that hadn't been manufactured by Bell Telephone. At 11 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms with his usual measured dignity, but his expression changed the moment Fritz presented the contaminated paprika. He opened the jar, inhaled deeply, and his nostrils flared with the controlled precision of a wine expert detecting cork taint. "Deplorable," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine offense. "This is not merely theft or vandalism, Fritz. This is desecration. Someone has violated the sanctity of your kitchen to deliver a personal insult disguised as culinary sabotage." I reported my own discoveries. The surveillance equipment, the subtle rearrangements, the evidence of systematic intrusion. Wolfe listened with the focused attention he reserved for information that would fundamentally alter his strategy. "They have been in my house," he said finally, his voice carrying a note I had rarely heard. Cold, controlled fury. "They have touched my possessions, breathed my air, and contaminated my food. This is no longer a matter of professional challenge. This has become personal." The telephone rang, interrupting what promised to be a more intensive analysis. I answered it carefully, aware that our conversation might now have additional listeners. Nero Wolfe's office. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Leland Purvis from Bank Security. I thought you'd want to see something that arrived at my office this morning." 20 minutes later, Purvis stood in our office holding a manila envelope with no return address and a Midtown Station postmark. Inside was a glossy 8x10 photograph showing a man in a camel hair coat and a gray fedora with a green feather standing at a bank teller's window. The man's face was turned 3/4 toward the camera, revealing an easy smile, neat hair, and a small scar above his left eyebrow. "It's a still from a security camera," Purvis explained, "but it's been enhanced. Someone with technical skill has improved the resolution and adjusted the details." Wolfe examined the photograph without touching it, his expression suggesting he was studying a particularly interesting species of poisonous snake. "Mr. Purvis, you mentioned that copies are being distributed." "This morning. I'd guess Inspector Kramer has one by now. Probably the district attorney's office, too. Someone's making sure this gets maximum circulation." After Purvis left, I called Saul Panzer and requested his immediate presence for what I described as a matter of considerable urgency involving unwanted guests in the brownstone. He arrived within 20 minutes, carrying his specialized equipment and wearing the expression of a man who had expected this call. His examination of the brownstone was methodical and disturbing. In addition to the telephone bug, he discovered a small transmitter in the dining room chandelier and a flat listening device adhered to the inside lid of Fritz's Piment d'Espelette jar. Each device was professionally installed and designed to capture conversations in the areas where Wolfe conducted his most sensitive business. "Whoever did this knows your routines," Saul reported. "They wanted the office for business discussions and the dining room for meal conversations. The kitchen device suggests they understand that important information often gets shared over food. Can you neutralize them without alerting the listeners? Better than that, I can install a mirror system that lets us hear what they're hearing while feeding them selected information when we choose to." Saul's smile was not pleasant. "If they want to eavesdrop, we can make sure they hear exactly what we want them to hear." While Saul worked on his electronic countermeasures, I reflected on the escalation we had witnessed. The campaign against us had evolved from external impersonation to internal violation, from professional attack to personal assault. Someone had invested considerable resources in a scheme designed not merely to frame me for theft, but to destroy Wolfe's sense of security and control. The telephone rang again. Saul's equipment indicated that our listeners were now active. I answered it with deliberate casualness. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Mrs. Ashford. Something terrible has happened. Someone broke into my apartment last night. They didn't take anything, but they photographed documents from my personal files. My financial records, my business correspondence, even personal letters." "Did you report it to the police?" "Yes, but they said there was little they could do without evidence of actual theft. The strange thing is that whoever did this tried to put everything back exactly as they found it. But I know my own belongings, Mr. Goodwin. Someone spent hours going through my most private papers." I assured Mrs. Ashford that we would investigate and suggested she come to the office that afternoon, bringing Eleanor Vance and requesting that Marcus Thorne join them. After I hung up, Wolfe regarded me with the expression of a chess master who had just seen his opponent's strategy revealed. "The burglary serves two purposes," he observed. "First, to gather additional ammunition for their campaign against us. Second, to demonstrate to Mrs. Ashford that her association with us has made her a target. They are systematically isolating us while building their case." "But they've made a mistake," I said, understanding his reasoning. "By violating the brownstone, they've escalated this from a professional challenge to a personal war. And in personal wars, you tend to fight by different rules." "Precisely." Wolfe pressed the button that would summon Fritz with beer. "Archie, tonight you will not be attending any mysterious meetings at waterfront piers. Instead, we shall arrange for our adversaries to come to us, where the advantages of terrain and preparation will be entirely ours." He turned his attention to the contaminated paprika jar, still sitting on his desk like evidence of a crime against civilization itself. "Someone has made the fundamental error of believing that my attachment to routine represents weakness rather than strength. They have mistaken the order of my household for vulnerability rather than strategic advantage. And how do we prove them wrong? By demonstrating that when the sanctity of my domain is violated, I become considerably less predictable and infinitely more dangerous." Wolfe reached for his beer with the measured precision of a man preparing for war. "They have declared themselves our enemies through deed rather than word. Tonight we shall accept their declaration and respond accordingly." The quiet war had just become a siege, and Nero Wolfe had decided that the time for defensive measures was over. The counterattack, when it came, would be as methodical and devastating as the man who planned it. Outside, the autumn afternoon continued its deceptive calm, but inside the brownstone, the machinery of intellectual warfare was beginning to turn with the precision of a Swiss watch and the inexorability of natural law. The morning calm shattered at 10:15 when the doorbell announced what Fritz described as a delegation with briefcases and the demeanor of tax collectors. I looked up from my typewriter to see Inspector Kramer leading a procession that included Sergeant Stebbins, Assistant District Attorney Henley, and a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who carried himself with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling other people's secrets. "Wolfe," Kramer said without ceremony, settling into the red leather chair with the weary resignation of a man who had spent the morning explaining why he couldn't arrest someone based on a photograph. "We've got developments, none of them good for your boy here." Henley stepped forward with the eager energy of ambition barely contained. "Mr. Wolfe, we have a warrant for Mr. Goodwin's typewriter and a formal request that he present himself for questioning at 3 o'clock this afternoon." He produced a manila envelope with the flourish of a magician, revealing his best trick. "We've also received this." The envelope contained a photostatic copy of a typed letter, ostensibly from me, offering to return a portion of Mrs. Ashford's money in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The typing showed the familiar quirks of our office Remington, the missing serif on the lowercase t, and the slight misalignment of the A that I had been meaning to have repaired for months. "Interesting," Wolfe observed, examining the letter without touching it. "And you conclude from this that Mr. Goodwin typed it?" "The typewriter characteristics are distinctive," the thin man said, introducing himself as Leonard Marsh from the police laboratory. "The defects match those of a Remington Portable, vintage 1947 or 1948. We'd like to compare test samples." I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. Someone had used our typewriter to compose that letter, which meant they had been in this office, in this room, while we slept. The violation was as personal as it was professional. "You may examine the machine," Wolfe said with dangerous calm, "but you will not remove it from these premises without proper judicial authority. This office has already suffered sufficient intrusion." After the official delegation departed with their photographs and test samples, Saul Panzer arrived with equipment that looked like it belonged in a radio station. He worked with silent efficiency, installing devices that would transform our presumed vulnerability into strategic advantage. "They've been listening to us," he reported, showing me a small black disc he had extracted from the telephone mouthpiece. "Professional installation, probably Monday night. But now we can feed them whatever we want them to hear." Wolfe's eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. "Excellent. Prepare a recording, Saul. Something to suggest that we have identified their financial conduit and plan to expose it this evening." While Saul worked his electronic magic, I made the rounds of our suspects. Arthur Corrigan, huddled in his rooming house like a man waiting for the final blow, provided an alibi that was crude but probably genuine. His desperation was real, but his surprise at the details of my impersonation seemed authentic. Eleanor Vance, still at her desk at 7 o'clock, maintained her professional composure with the skill of long practice. But I noticed things, the way her hands trembled slightly when she handled papers, the quick glance toward Mrs. Ashford's office when she thought I wasn't looking, the careful precision with which she answered questions about banking procedures. "You handle Mrs. Ashford's personal banking?" I asked. "I coordinate with her financial advisor on routine matters. Mrs. Ashford prefers to handle significant transactions personally." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath, a tension that suggested she was working very hard to appear calm. Marcus Thorne received me in his corner office with the confident ease of a man who believed himself in complete control. His handshake was calculated, his smile professional, and his answers too smooth to be entirely trustworthy. "This business with Victoria's check is quite disturbing," he said, settling back in his leather chair. "Have you considered that this might be the work of a competitor? Someone seeking to damage both our business and yours?" "The level of personal detail suggests someone with direct access," I replied, watching his reaction carefully. "Someone who knows Mrs. Ashford's banking habits, my daily routines, even phrases that my employer uses regularly." Something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or satisfaction. "Eleanor is remarkably devoted to Victoria's interests," he said, and the way he emphasized devoted carried implications that could have been admiration or something more calculating. When I returned to the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his chair with a book on Chinese ceramics, but his attention was focused on the small speaker Saul had installed near his desk. Our electronic audience was active, and Wolfe was preparing to give them a performance. "Archie," he said, his voice carrying clearly to the hidden microphones. "I want you to telephone Mrs. Ashford this evening. Inform her that we have traced the payments to North River Consultancy and identified the intermediary. Tell her we plan to reveal our findings at 9 o'clock tonight." I made the call, aware that every word was being transmitted to our unseen listeners. Mrs. Ashford agreed to come, bringing Eleanor and requesting that Marcus Thorne join them. Her voice carried the strain of someone who had spent the day discovering that her most trusted relationships might be built on deception. "There's something else," she said before hanging up. "I found a photograph in my mail this afternoon. It shows someone who looks exactly like Mr. Goodwin at the bank, but there's something wrong with it. The lighting is too perfect, the details too sharp. It looks like it was enhanced." At 8 o'clock, Kramer arrived with Stebbins and the expression of a man who had spent the day fielding calls from reporters and politicians. "Wolfe, this thing's all over the evening papers. Private eye under cloud in bank fraud case. They've got Goodwin's photo and quotes from anonymous sources." "Orchestrated publicity," Wolfe replied. "Someone is ensuring maximum exposure for their fabricated evidence. They want Mr. Goodwin arrested publicly, dramatically, and irreversibly." "Well, they might get their wish," Kramer said grimly. "The commissioner's breathing down my neck, and Henley's got the DA convinced he's got an airtight case. You better have something concrete tonight, or I'll be serving that warrant myself." Wolfe pressed the button that would summon Fritz with beer. "Inspector, someone has declared war on my establishment. They have violated my home, contaminated my food, and attempted to destroy the reputation that is the foundation of my professional existence. This is no longer merely a case. It is a reckoning. And how do you plan to deliver this reckoning? By demonstrating that when one attacks Nero Wolfe, one should be prepared for the consequences." His smile was not pleasant. "Our adversaries believe they have forced us into a defensive position. They're about to discover their error." The doorbell rang at 8:30, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Ashford, Eleanor Vance, and Marcus Thorne. They entered with the wary courtesy of people who weren't entirely certain why they had been summoned, but suspected it wouldn't be pleasant. Fritz served sherry with his usual impeccable precision, but I noticed him watching our guests with the careful attention of a man who had taken the violation of his kitchen personally. The atmosphere in the room was charged with unspoken tensions, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Thank you for coming," Wolfe said, his voice deceptively mild. "I trust you understand that this evening will determine whether justice is served or perverted, whether truth emerges or remains buried beneath layers of calculated deception." Eleanor Vance's hand trembled slightly as she raised her sherry glass, and Marcus Thorne's urbane composure showed the first hairline cracks. Mrs. Ashford sat rigidly upright, her face pale but determined. The stage was set, the players assembled, and Nero Wolfe was about to demonstrate why it was unwise to trespass in his domain. The brownstone, once violated, was now poised to deliver its own form of justice, methodical, inexorable, and absolutely final. Outside, the October evening settled over West 35th Street with deceptive calm, but inside the office, the machinery of intellectual warfare was beginning to turn with the precision of a Swiss watch and the inevitability of natural law. The evenings. Performance began at 9 o'clock, with Wolfe opening his second bottle of beer and regarding his assembled audience with the expression of a chess master who had just forced his opponent into an untenable position. The office had transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with Mrs. Ashford seated in the red leather chair, her composure brittle as autumn ice. Eleanor Vance perched on the edge of the yellow chair, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and Marcus Thorne maintaining his urbane facade in a straight-backed chair that Fritz had positioned with mathematical precision. Inspector Kramer occupied his usual spot near the door, close enough to watch faces but far enough to avoid interfering with Wolfe's orchestration. Sergeant Stebbins stood in the hallway, radiating the patient menace of a man who preferred action to conversation, but understood the value of both. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "this evening we shall resolve a conspiracy that has been conducted with remarkable sophistication and deplorable judgment. Someone has invested considerable time, money, and effort in an elaborate scheme designed not merely to steal $25,000, but to destroy the very foundation of trust upon which my professional existence rests." The small speaker near his desk crackled to life with Saul Panzer's voice, calm and professional. North River Consultancy confirmed. The subject took the bait. Westside Depot, locker 312, opened at 9:17. Contents retrieved include a complete impersonation kit, makeup, adhesive prosthetics, bay rum cologne, and a gray fedora with green feather. Also recovered, 5 forged driver's licenses, typing samples matching your Remington's defects, and detailed notes on Mr. Goodwin's daily routines. Eleanor Vance's carefully maintained composure developed its first visible crack, a slight tremor in her left eye that suggested considerable strain beneath her professional exterior. Marcus Thorne's urbane mask remained in place, but I noticed his fingers drumming silently against his knee, a nervous habit that contradicted his appearance of calm confidence. "Most illuminating," Wolfe observed, pressing his fingertips together in the gesture that always preceded his most devastating revelations. "Someone has been conducting systematic surveillance of this establishment, learning our routines, our speech patterns, our vulnerabilities. The question is not whether Mr. Goodwin has been framed. That is established fact. The question is by whom and for what ultimate purpose." He turned his attention to Mrs. Ashford, whose face had gone pale as she began to comprehend the scope of the deception surrounding her. "Madam, you have been both victim and unwitting accomplice in this scheme. Your genuine distress has provided credibility to fabricated evidence. Your trust has been weaponized against innocent parties, and your personal relationships have been systematically manipulated." "I don't understand," Mrs. Ashford whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" "Someone with intimate access to your financial arrangements, your personal habits, and your emotional vulnerabilities," Wolfe replied. "Someone who possessed both the knowledge necessary to forge your signature convincingly and the psychological insight required to predict your reactions with mathematical precision." The telephone rang, interrupting the mounting tension. I answered it, aware that every word was being analyzed by our electronic audience. Nero Wolfe's office. "Archie, it's Saul. The subject who retrieved the kit led us to Danny Morse, the publicity agent who's been spreading rumors about you and Wolfe. Morse is singing like a canary. 5,000 down, 5,000 more when the story breaks in the papers. The money came through an intermediary, but he let slip that his client has intimate knowledge of how private investigators really operate." I thanked Saul and hung up, noting that Eleanor Vance had gone rigid in her chair, while Marcus Thorne had begun calculating new positions with the desperate precision of a chess player facing inevitable checkmate. "Mr. Morse has proven most cooperative," Wolfe announced to the room. "The systematic campaign to destroy our reputation was financed through intermediaries, but the ultimate source possessed detailed knowledge of our methods and procedures. Knowledge that could only have been acquired through direct observation of our operations." He opened the manila folder that contained the photostatic evidence. The forged confession letter, allegedly typed by Mr. Goodwin, bears the distinctive defects of our office Remington, the missing serif on the lowercase t, and the slight misalignment of the AE. However, the letter was composed Monday night between 10 o'clock and midnight. while both Mr. Goodwin and I were asleep. Someone entered this office, sat at that desk, and impersonated Mr. Goodwin with their fingertips. Eleanor's breathing had become shallow and controlled, the kind of measured respiration that suggested someone fighting to maintain composure under extreme pressure. "This is all very interesting, Mr. Wolfe, but I fail to see how it relates to Mrs. Ashford's stolen money." "It relates because the theft was merely the opening gambit in a more complex strategy," Wolfe replied with dangerous calm. "The true objective was to eliminate Mr. Goodwin as an investigative threat, thereby paralyzing my ability to expose a far more significant crime that has been ongoing for months." Marcus Thorne leaned forward slightly, his urbane composure finally showing hairline cracks. "What kind of crime?" "Systematic embezzlement, conducted with remarkable sophistication and concealed through a series of shell companies and false invoices." Wolfe's gaze fixed on Thorne with the intensity of a laser. "Someone has been diverting funds from Mrs. Ashford's business into accounts they control, using Arthur Corrigan's gambling debts as camouflage for their own far more extensive theft." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Mrs. Ashford turned to stare at Marcus with dawning horror, while Eleanor's professional mask finally began to disintegrate completely. "The amounts were small enough to escape casual notice," Wolfe continued relentlessly. "But over 18 months, they totaled nearly $200,000. When Mr. Corrigan's exposure became inevitable, the true embezzler needed a new strategy, one that would discredit any investigation while simultaneously eliminating the person most likely to uncover their activities." "That's preposterous," Thorne protested, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Is it? Miss Vance, you discovered Mr. Thorne's embezzlement through your own investigation, didn't you? Your devotion to Mrs. Ashford led you to examine the company's financial records with the thoroughness of a trained accountant. What you found was evidence of systematic theft disguised as legitimate business expenses." Eleanor's composure cracked visibly. "I was trying to protect Victoria from being hurt financially and emotionally. Marcus was stealing from her while pretending to care about her. So you decided to collaborate with him in framing Mr. Goodwin for a crime he didn't commit?" I asked, understanding the full scope of the conspiracy for the first time. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Marcus said we would just discredit your investigation, make it look like you were corrupt. He said the frame would be temporary, just long enough to throw suspicion off his activities." Marcus Thorne had been sitting in stunned silence, but now he found his voice. "Eleanor, you're hysterical. These accusations are completely unfounded." "Are they?" Wolfe asked, his tone suggesting he found Thorne's denials tedious rather than convincing. "The break-in at Mrs. Ashford's apartment was designed to gather additional information for your impersonation of Mr. Goodwin, while simultaneously demonstrating to Mrs. Ashford that her association with us had made her a target. The violation of this brownstone served the dual purpose of planting evidence and installing surveillance equipment to monitor our investigation." He pressed the button that would summon Fritz, but instead of beer, Fritz brought another manila envelope that Saul had delivered during our dinner preparation. The financial records Miss Vance photographed from Mrs. Ashford's apartment provided the information necessary to forge her signature convincingly and to understand her banking patterns well enough to make the impersonation credible. Mrs. Ashford was staring at both Eleanor and Marcus with the expression of someone discovering that her most trusted relationships had been built on systematic deception. 8 years, she said to Eleanor, her voice barely above a whisper. 8 years of trusting you, depending on you, treating you like family. "I love you, Victoria," Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her face. "Everything I did was to protect you from him. Marcus has been stealing from you, lying to you, planning to take everything and disappear. And your solution was to frame innocent people for crimes they didn't commit." Mrs. Ashford's voice carried a note I had rarely heard, the sound of trust dying in real time. The office fell silent except for the familiar sounds of the house around us. Fritz in the kitchen, the elevator's distant hum, the autumn wind against the windows. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "Miss Vance, your devotion to Mrs. Ashford was genuine, but it was also possessive and ultimately destructive. Mr. Thorne, your embezzlement was systematic and sophisticated, but your attempt to frame Mr. Goodwin was both crude and self-defeating." He reached for his beer with the measured precision of a man who had just completed the most challenging portion of a complex task. "The conspiracy between you required Miss Vance's intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's affairs and Mr. Thorne's understanding of financial manipulation. Together, you created an elaborate deception designed to eliminate the one investigator capable of exposing your crimes." The doorbell rang, announcing Inspector Kramer's return with the apparatus of official justice. But Wolfe held up one massive hand, indicating that the performance was not yet complete. "There remains one final element to be resolved," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "The question of which conspirator conceived this elaborate scheme and which merely executed it under duress." The tension in the room became almost unbearable as Wolfe prepared to deliver his final, devastating revelation. The brownstone, once violated and disturbed, was about to reassert its formidable order with the precision that had always been Nero Wolfe's greatest weapon. Outside, the October evening continued its deceptive calm, but inside the office, justice was preparing to make its final, inexorable appearance. Wolfe set down his beer with the deliberate precision of a judge preparing to pronounce sentence, his massive frame settling into the chair with the weight of absolute certainty. The office had become a courtroom where truth would finally triumph over elaborate deception. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him legendary, "this evening we shall resolve a conspiracy that represents not merely theft, but a profound violation of trust, loyalty, and the very foundations of human decency." He pressed his fingertips together in the familiar gesture that always preceded his most devastating revelations. The frame against Mr. Goodwin was orchestrated with remarkable sophistication, requiring intimate knowledge of his appearance, his mannerisms, his speech patterns, and most significantly, access to the sanctity of this brownstone itself. Eleanor Vance sat rigid in her chair, her professional composure showing hairline cracks like porcelain under stress. Marcus Thorne maintained his urbane facade, but his fingers had begun that unconscious drumming against his knee that betrayed his growing desperation. The technical evidence. "The forged confession letter," Wolfe continued, opening the manila folder, "bears the distinctive defects of our office, Remington, the missing serif on the lowercase at and the misaligned a. However, it also reveals something more significant. The ribbon was reversed Monday afternoon by Mr. Goodwin as part of his routine maintenance. The letter shows darkened capitals in the first 8 lines and lighter thereafter, indicating that the typist cranked the tension to compensate for what they perceived as a fading ribbon. I nodded, remembering the routine adjustment I had made without conscious thought. I always keep the tension light. Someone unfamiliar with the machine would naturally try to darken the impression. Precisely. Someone who handles correspondence daily but does not type extensively would make exactly that error. Wolfe's gaze fixed on Eleanor with laser intensity. "Miss Vance, your fingerprints are on the tension adjustment knob, placed there sometime between Monday evening and Tuesday morning." Eleanor's carefully controlled breathing became more rapid, but she remained silent. "The contamination of Fritz's paprika provides even more damning evidence," Wolfe continued. "The seal was lifted and replaced, but not with the precision of a professional. The paper was worked with a thumbnail and smoothed with hand cream, jasmine and almond scented. Fritz observed the residue when you visited with Mrs. Ashford 2 weeks ago. Fritz, appearing in the doorway as if summoned, nodded once. The same scent, Mr. Wolfe. Unmistakable. The psychological revelation. Wolfe leaned back, his expression shifting from technical analysis to psychological dissection. Miss Vance, your devotion to Mrs. Ashford has been the defining characteristic of your professional relationship for 8 years. But devotion, when it becomes possessive, transforms from protection into control. I was protecting Victoria, Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. Were you? Or were you protecting your position as the indispensable guardian of her affairs? Wolfe's voice carried the weight of absolute judgment. When you discovered Mr. Thorne's embezzlement through your own investigation of the company's financial records, you faced a choice. You could have simply exposed him to Mrs. Ashford and the authorities. Instead, you saw an opportunity. Mrs. Ashford stared at Eleanor with dawning horror. An opportunity for what? To eliminate Mr. Thorne as a threat while simultaneously ensuring that no outside investigator could ever again challenge your interpretation of events, Wolfe replied. By framing Mr. Goodwin for theft and discrediting this establishment, you would guarantee that Mrs. Ashford would turn to you exclusively for guidance and protection. Thorne's secondary role. Wolfe turned his attention to Marcus Thorne, whose urbane composure was finally showing visible cracks. Mr. Thorne, your embezzlement of nearly $200,000 over 18 months was systematic and sophisticated. When Miss Vance confronted you with evidence of your theft, she did not threaten exposure. She offered partnership. That's not, Thorne began, but Wolfe cut him off with a gesture. She proposed that you finance an elaborate frame against Mr. Goodwin, using your connections in the banking industry and your knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's financial arrangements. In exchange, she would ensure that your exposure came at a time and in a manner that would minimize damage to Mrs. Ashford's reputation and, more importantly, to her own position. The telephone rang, and I answered it, recognizing Saul's voice with its characteristic precision. Archie, we've got the complete picture. The locker contained psychological profiles of Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford written in Thorne's handwriting, but they were based on information that could only have come from Eleanor herself. She's been feeding him intelligence about Mrs. Ashford's vulnerabilities for months. The conspiracy revealed the impersonator, Wolfe continued after I relayed Saul's information, was coached with details that required intimate knowledge of Mr. Goodwin's habits and my own speech patterns. The phrase, "we're not in a race," one of my favorite expressions, was used deliberately to create a personal connection between the fraud and this office. Eleanor's professional mask finally disintegrated completely. I never meant for it to go this far, she sobbed. I just wanted to protect Victoria from the scandal, from the pain of discovering that Marcus was stealing from her. And yet you chose to compound that betrayal by orchestrating an even more elaborate deception, Wolfe observed with cold precision. You violated the sanctity of my home, contaminated my food, and attempted to destroy the reputation of an innocent man. All in the name of protection that was, in reality, control. The final confrontation. Mrs. Ashford found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. 8 years, Eleanor. 8 years of trusting you, depending on you, treating you like family. And this is how you repaid that trust? I love you, Victoria, Eleanor replied through her tears. Everything I did was because I love you. Love does not manipulate, Wolfe said with finality. Love does not deceive. Love does not destroy innocent people to maintain an illusion of protection. What you call love, Miss Vance, is possession. What you call protection is control. The doorbell announced Inspector Kramer's return with Sergeant Stebbins and the apparatus of official justice. They entered with the measured precision of men who had spent the evening preparing warrants and coordinating with the district attorney's office. Wolfe, Kramer said, settling into his familiar position. Please tell me you've got something concrete this time. Inspector, Wolfe replied with satisfaction, I have recorded confessions, recovered physical evidence, financial records, and testimony that will eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt. Miss Eleanor Vance and Mr. Marcus Thorne have conspired to embezzle nearly $200,000 from Mrs. Ashford, while simultaneously framing Mr. Goodwin for a crime he did not commit. Justice delivered. The arrests were conducted with quiet efficiency. Eleanor rose without being touched, looking at Mrs. Ashford with an expression that carried both love and profound regret. Marcus Thorne maintained his composure to the end, but his silence spoke louder than any protest of innocence. As the procession departed, the brownstone seemed to exhale, releasing tension that had accumulated over days of violation and uncertainty. Mrs. Ashford remained, looking suddenly fragile in the aftermath of such comprehensive betrayal. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Wolfe replied, "you hire an auditor to assess the full extent of Mr. Thorne's theft. You endure the publicity with dignity, and you learn to trust your own judgment rather than relying exclusively on others to interpret the world for you." She nodded, understanding that her education in independence was just beginning. "I owe Mr. Goodwin an apology." "Accepted," I said. "And if you want to include a dozen of those almond crescents from your neighborhood bakery, I won't object." After she left, the office returned to its proper proportions. Fritz appeared with fresh beer and the evening's restored tranquility. The desk blotter sat correctly. The telephone contained only what Bell Telephone had intended, and the contaminated paprika had been ceremoniously discarded. "Archie," Wolfe said, settling into his evening routine, "inform Mr. Henley tomorrow that Miss Vance's cooperation should be considered in her prosecution. The law, when it permits, should distinguish between malice and tragic miscalculation." "And Thorne?" "Mr. Thorne's crimes were calculated and systematic. He deserves whatever justice the courts provide." Wolfe opened his book, then looked up with a final observation. "It is remarkable how often the greatest betrayals come not from enemies, but from those who claim to love us most." The brownstone settled into its evening calm, its sanctuary restored and its order re-established. Justice had been served with the methodical precision that was Nero Wolfe's greatest weapon, and the October night outside seemed suddenly less threatening than it had for days. In the end, it was not violence or dramatic confrontation that had solved the case, but the application of logic, observation, and an understanding of human nature in all its complexity. The frame had been exposed, the conspiracy unraveled, and the truth revealed through the patient accumulation of evidence and the inexorable force of deductive reasoning. The war was over, and Nero Wolfe had won it without leaving his chair. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of October clarity that made the brownstone feel newly consecrated, as if the autumn air itself had performed an exorcism on the violated spaces of our domain. I was at my desk by 8:30, savoring the particular satisfaction that comes from reading newspapers that describe you as cleared of all charges, rather than wanted for questioning, when Fritz appeared with his silver tray and an expression that suggested civilization had not merely returned, but had brought reinforcements. "Inspector Kramer telephoned," he announced with the precise diction he reserved for official communications. "Mr. Gideon Lake, the impersonator, has provided a complete confession. He identifies Miss Vance as his source of personal details about your habits, and Mr. Thorne as his financial patron. The district attorney's office has formally apologized for what Mr. Henley described as regrettable haste influenced by orchestrated publicity." The morning brought a parade of resolutions that felt almost anticlimactic after the dramatic unraveling in Wolfe's office. Arthur Corrigan appeared at 10 o'clock, transformed from the desperate figure I had encountered in his rooming house into something approaching respectability. He carried a modest bouquet of chrysanthemums and the careful dignity of a man rebuilding his life one gesture at a time. "Mrs. Ashford called yesterday," he reported, settling into the red leather chair with obvious relief. "She's offered me a position with a textile company her cousin owns in Philadelphia. Not much money, but it's honest work and a chance to start over. She said she understood what it meant to be betrayed by people you trusted." The technical resolution. At 11 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms and immediately set about the methodical business of ensuring that justice was not merely served, but properly seasoned. Saul Panzer arrived with a banker's box containing the complete financial trail that had funded our elaborate frame. North River Consultancy traces through 3 shell companies to a family trust Mr. Thorne established in Manhasset. Saul reported with the satisfaction of a man who had untangled a particularly complex knot. The money for Danny Morse's publicity campaign, the payments to Gideon Lake, even the rent on the storage locker, all documented and traceable. The impersonator himself, it emerged, was a failed actor named Gideon Lake who specialized in quick-change artistry and had been chosen specifically for his ability to study and replicate mannerisms. His confession provided the final pieces of evidence needed to demonstrate the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. Tlaquang confirms that Miss Vance provided detailed notes on your appearance, speech patterns, and daily routines, Kramer reported during his afternoon visit. She even coached him on phrases like "much obliged" and "we're not in a race," things she'd heard repeatedly during your investigation of Corrigan. Eleanor's final revelation, the most disturbing development, came through Eleanor Vance's expanded confession from the Women's House of Detention. She had requested a meeting with Wolfe, claiming additional information that would change our understanding of the conspiracy's scope. The embezzlement was far more extensive than you discovered. She revealed her professional composure finally completely shattered. Marcus wasn't just stealing from Victoria. He was running a systematic operation involving at least 6 other import businesses. The total theft probably approaches $1 million. The documents she provided revealed a criminal enterprise of remarkable sophistication, using legitimate import businesses as fronts for financial manipulation on a massive scale. The frame against me had been necessary not merely to discredit our investigation, but to prevent the exposure of an interstate criminal network. I thought I could handle him quietly, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. Make him return the money gradually without destroying Victoria's reputation. But he threatened to claim she was his partner, that she knew about everything. I couldn't let that happen to her. Fritz's sacred restoration. While the legal machinery ground through its necessary processes, Fritz conducted his own ceremony of restoration. The contaminated paprika had been ceremoniously discarded, replaced with a sealed tin of genuine shigidi that he handled with the reverence of a priest consecrating sacred vessels. I have examined the seal under a magnifier, he announced, placing the new jar in the spice rack with mathematical precision, and I have changed the locks on the spice cabinet. The sanctity of the kitchen will not be violated again. The evening's dinner became a celebration of restored order. Fritz served chicken paprikash, prepared with the replacement paprika, and I watched Wolfe take his first bite with the focused attention of a wine expert detecting the subtlest notes. His slight nod of approval carried the weight of absolute vindication. Rehabilitated, he pronounced, and Fritz's smile could have illuminated the entire brownstone. Mrs. Ashford's reckoning. Mrs. Ashford's final visit came Thursday evening, bringing not only the promised almond crescents, but also the weary wisdom of someone who had discovered that her most trusted relationships had been built on systematic deception. 8 years, she said quietly, settling into the red leather chair with the careful movements of someone learning to navigate a world where certainty had become a luxury. 8 years of trusting Eleanor, depending on her, treating her like family. How could I have been so blind? Madam, Wolfe replied with uncharacteristic gentleness, the most effective deceptions are woven from threads of genuine emotion. Miss Vance's devotion to you was real, but it became possessive rather than protective. Her love transformed into control, and her control required the elimination of anyone who might challenge her interpretation of your best interests. The legal aftermath would be complex and lengthy. Federal authorities had assumed jurisdiction over Thorne's interstate criminal enterprise, while Eleanor faced charges that her cooperation might mitigate but could not eliminate. The publicity would be uncomfortable but manageable, focusing on the sophistication of the conspiracy rather than the personalities involved. Wolfe's final judgment, as the October evening settled over West 35th Street with genuine tranquility rather than deceptive calm, Wolfe opened his book on Chinese ceramics and offered his final reflection on the case that had transformed me temporarily from investigator to suspect. "Archie," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "to trespass is to assert dominion. It is not the theft of objects that offends. Objects can be replaced, but the theft of order. Miss Vance and Mr. Thorne did not merely steal money. They attempted to steal the very foundation of trust upon which civilized relationships depend." He took a contemplative sip of beer, then continued. "The desire to control others, to manipulate circumstances according to one's own vision of propriety, ultimately leads to a distortion of reality so complete that the manipulator becomes trapped within their own labyrinth of deception. The return to order. By 10 o'clock, the brownstone had returned to its proper proportions. The new locks answered with satisfying precision. The telephone contained only legitimate circuitry, and the spice rack stood as a monument to restored domestic sanctity. I straightened the desk blotter, the correct way, not the saboteur's way, and reflected on the peculiar experience of being framed for a crime I hadn't committed. "Well," I said to Wolfe as he prepared to end his day with characteristic finality, "do I get hazard pay for impersonating myself badly?" "Piffle," he replied without opening his eyes. "You are not in danger because you are innocent. You are in danger because presumptuous individuals had allies among the credulous. However, if it pleases you, I will add $25 to your Christmas envelope." "St. Nicholas Wolfe," I said. "I'll try not to spend it all on green feathers." He opened one eye just enough to register mild disapproval. "Archie." "Yes, sir?" "We are not in a race." "Glad to hear it," I replied. "I've had my fill of sprints for 1 week." The brownstone settled into the evening with the satisfaction of a fortress that had successfully repelled invasion. Order had been restored, justice properly administered, and the understanding reaffirmed that when Nero Wolfe's domain is threatened, the response will be methodical, devastating, and absolutely final. Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal conversation with the night. But inside our little republic on West 35th Street, all was as it should be, secure, civilized, and properly seasoned. Friday morning arrived with the kind of November clarity that made the brownstone feel newly consecrated, as if the autumn air itself had performed an exorcism on every corner where deception had once lurked. I was at my desk by 8:30, savoring the particular satisfaction that comes from reading newspapers that describe you as fully exonerated, rather than wanted for questioning, when Fritz appeared with his silver tray and an expression that suggested civilization had not merely returned, but had brought reinforcements. "Inspector Kramer telephoned," he announced with the precise diction he reserved for official communications. "The federal investigation has concluded. Mr. Thorne's criminal enterprise involved 11 companies across 5 states, with total theft exceeding $1.3 million. Miss Vance's cooperation has resulted in the recovery of nearly $800,000. The morning brought a parade of vindications that felt almost anticlimactic after the dramatic unraveling in Wolfe's office. Lon Cohen called before my second cup of coffee, offering column space for what it felt like to be the goat at a lion taming. I gave him as much as was good for business, knowing that Lon understood not to ask how the sausage was made when he liked the way it tasted. Assistant District Attorney Henley followed with a voice pitched midway between apology and law school, using the word unfortunate twice and systemic once, promising a public statement and asking whether Wolfe would mind a private word with the district attorney about safeguards against prejudicial publicity. I told him Mr. Wolfe did mind. He minded everything that involved leaving the house, but that he could have a private word here. with Fritz pouring the coffee and the orchids listening. The professional aftermath. At 11 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms with the measured dignity of a man whose faith in the natural order had been thoroughly validated. He settled into his chair with the satisfaction of someone whose domain had not merely been restored, but had emerged stronger from the assault upon it. "The morning mail brings additional vindication," I reported as Fritz brought the first beer of the day. "A check from Fidelity Insurance for exposing what they call the most sophisticated embezzlement scheme in the company's 40-year history. More satisfying than the money is their chief investigator's letter acknowledging that our methods succeeded where traditional auditing failed completely. And the legal resolutions. Eleanor Vance received 18 months federal with credit for cooperation. Her testimony led to 6 additional arrests in Thorne's network. Marcus Thorne got 7 years, plus restitution. The judge described his operation as a betrayal of trust on a scale that demanded significant consequences. Wolfe nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions had been validated by events. Miss Vance's tragedy lies not in her punishment, but in her failure to understand that love cannot coexist with control. Mr. Thorne's fate is simpler. He gambled with other people's trust and lost. Character resolutions. The afternoon brought Mrs. Ashford's final visit, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate a world where certainty was no longer guaranteed, but wisdom had become possible. She placed a small wrapped package on Wolfe's desk. "This is for Fritz," she said. "Genuine Hungarian paprika from a specialty shop in Budapest. I thought he might appreciate having a reserve supply that hasn't been, compromised." When Fritz received the gift, his reaction carried the weight of professional vindication mixed with personal satisfaction. He opened the tin carefully, inhaled deeply, and nodded with the authority of a master craftsman evaluating superior materials. "Exceptional quality," he pronounced. "This will be reserved for special occasions when Mr. Wolfe requires paprikash prepared with absolute authenticity." He paused, then added with rare emotion, "Mrs. Ashford understands that the violation of a kitchen is not merely practical. It is personal." Arthur Corrigan's letter from Philadelphia reported that his new position was providing both financial stability and personal redemption. "I understand now what it means to be falsely accused," he wrote. "The experience has taught me empathy for others who find themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control." Fritz's sacred restoration. The brownstone itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Fritz had conducted his own ceremony of restoration with the thoroughness that had made him indispensable for 15 years. The new locks answered with satisfying precision. The telephone contained only legitimate circuitry, and the spice rack stood as a monument to restored domestic sanctity. "I've examined every seal under a magnifier," he announced, placing the new paprika tin in the spice rack with mathematical precision. "And I've changed not only the locks, but installed a new security system. The sanctity of this house will not be violated again." The evening's dinner became a celebration of restored order. Fritz served chicken paprikash prepared with Mrs. Ashford's gift paprika, and I watched Wolfe take his first bite with the focused attention of a wine expert, detecting the subtlest notes. His slight nod of approval carried the weight of absolute vindication. "Rehabilitated," he pronounced, and Fritz's smile could have illuminated the entire brown stone. Wolfe's final judgment. As the November afternoon settled into early dusk, Wolfe opened his evening beer and offered his final observations on the case that had temporarily transformed our brownstone from sanctuary into battlefield. "Archie," he began, his voice carrying the weight of considered judgment. "This case has demonstrated several fundamental principles about human nature and the administration of justice. The most dangerous enemies are often those who claim to act from love rather than hatred. Miss Vance's devotion to Mrs. Ashford was genuine, but it became possessive rather than protective." He took a contemplative sip of beer. Love that seeks to control rather than liberate ultimately destroys both the lover and the beloved. More significantly, sophisticated criminals often defeat themselves through excessive cleverness. Mr. Thorne's network was remarkably efficient, but his decision to frame you revealed the entire operation to scrutiny. And the larger lesson: that when one's domain is violated, the response must be proportional not to the immediate offense, but to the ultimate threat. His voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. Someone entered our home, contaminated our food, and attempted to destroy the reputation that is the foundation of our professional existence. Such trespass demands not merely correction, but comprehensive victory. He leaned back, his expression shifting to philosophical reflection. The desire for control, when unchecked by ethical considerations, often leads to a disproportionate and ultimately self-defeating application of force. Both conspirators confused the meticulousness of their planning with the righteousness of their cause. The return to perfect order. By 8 o'clock, the brownstone had settled into the rhythm that had been disrupted but never broken. The familiar sounds returned. Fritz in the kitchen, the elevator's distant hum, the autumn wind against windows that no longer harbored unwelcome listeners. Saul Panzer's final report provided the satisfying conclusion to our counterattack. The surveillance equipment he had installed had recorded conversations between Eleanor and Thorne that provided crucial evidence for federal prosecutors. The beauty of the operation, Saul explained with professional pride, was that they thought they were spying on you while you were actually controlling what they heard. As I prepared the day's final report on my new Remington, Wolfe's gift acknowledging a job well done, I reflected on the peculiar experience of being framed for a crime I hadn't committed. The conspiracy had been sophisticated, well-funded, and psychologically astute, but it had ultimately failed because it was built on the fundamental misconception that Nero Wolfe's attachment to routine represented weakness rather than strength. "Archie," Wolfe said as he prepared to end his day with characteristic finality, "someone once observed that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I would add that the price of civilization is the willingness to defend order against those who would impose their own vision of propriety through deception and manipulation. And the price of working for Nero Wolfe, the occasional opportunity to observe justice administered with precision, intelligence applied with purpose, and order restored through the patient accumulation of evidence and the inexorable force of deductive reasoning." He closed his book with the satisfaction of a man whose world had been challenged and had emerged victorious. Not an inconsiderable compensation for the inconvenience of temporary suspicion. Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal conversation with the night. But inside our little republic on West 35th Street, all was as it should be: secure, civilized, and properly defended. The brownstone stood as a monument to the principle that when intelligence is combined with integrity and supported by unshakable routine, even the most sophisticated assault will ultimately fail. The case was closed, the files properly organized, and the understanding reaffirmed that in Nero Wolfe's domain, justice is not merely an abstract concept, but a practical necessity administered with the precision of Swiss clockwork and the inevitability of natural law. We were not, as Wolfe would say, in a race. But we had certainly won this one.